What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch back here. In this video, I'm going to help you start off this 2020 fantasy season strong. With that W, pick up your first victory of the fantasy football season. This is my stardom, my situm for week number 1. The matchups that I love that you need to exploit in week number 1, and the matchups that you should probably stay away from, or at least the players you should probably stay away from here in week number 1. Before I give you my starts and my sits for fantasy football in week number 1 of the 2020 season, make sure you do spike that like button and subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more NFL and fantasy content just like this. Also, comment your questions below. Comment your opinion on certain fantasy matchups that you want to exploit this week. And also comment your fantasy questions. I'll be going live on Saturday, the day before the Sunday football games start. And I'll be answering all of your questions there live, as well as the ones that you leave in the comment section below. The sooner you see this video and leave your comment, the sooner I can think about your matchup and your decision within your lineup. So let's kick off week number 1, fantasy starts and sits with the quarterback position, a position that I know a lot of people, if you listen to me, you waited on it. So you're probably looking at a couple guys on your roster, or maybe potentially the best guy to stream this week. So let's start at that quarterback position. My starts this week in week number 1 for the quarterback position starts off with Big Ben. He is back. All reports are that Big Ben is healthy. He's ready to go. He's looking like the Ben of old, and he has a juicy week 1 matchup taking on the New York Giants defense. That was one of the worst versus the pass last season and has not gotten much better. They also have one of the worst pass rushing units in the NFL, and their cornerback position has taken a significant hit this offseason. Big Ben should have a huge week 1 comeback game. Derek Carr versus the Carolina Panthers. Derek Carr, send in the car versus Carolina. He really has a bunch more weapons, guys. Whether it's Edwards, the rookie, or Henry Ruggs in the first round, or Darren Waller, or Josh Jacobs. I mean, this guy is going to feast versus arguably the worst defense in the NFL with the worst cornerback position in the NFL. Derek Carr and this Raiders squad should put up a ton of points. So he is a sneaky start for week number 1. Jimmy G versus Arizona. Jimmy G really feasted on Arizona last year, played fantastic in both matchups. I understand that his receivers are going to be out or limited, at least his top 2 options in this game, but he still has George Kittle, he still has those great running backs, and he still has Kyle Shanahan. I expect this game to be higher scoring. I expect Jimmy G, that football will be in his hands, and I do expect it to be competitive, which means that the 49ers will have to pass in the fourth quarter, and this game will go down to the wire. I think Jimmy G is going to have actually a big season this year statistically, and I think it starts here in week number 1 versus a defense in Arizona that I'm not super high on. Cam Newton, he's back. He's in New England. Josh McDaniels, Bill Belichick, they've been scheming up all offseason ways to get Cam Newton involved in this offense and ways for him to dominate and take over. And Cam Newton's been smiling, he's been laughing through these press conferences and talking about how he feels great, how he's back physically, how he feels 100%. And Josh McDaniels, he had a few quotes throughout this offseason that makes me believe that Cam Newton is going to be heavily involved as a runner, not just as the passer in this offense. I think he has a chance for a massive week 1 game. He may struggle as a passer early on versus a pretty underrated secondary, but I would not be shocked if Cam put up a high rushing total and maybe a couple rushing touchdowns in his first game as a Patriot. My quarterback sits. Joe Burrow versus the Los Angeles Chargers. I understand that you want to get excited about seeing Joe Burrow in the NFL, but we really don't know first what he's going to look like in the NFL yet. And two, what this offense, with him in it, and with a offensive line that isn't exactly the greatest in the world, they're having to go up versus one of the most loaded defenses in the NFL from a talent perspective. I'm talking about the Chargers, a team with a great group of pass rushers, a very good secondary. The Chargers are just not a great matchup for any young quarterback. Carson Wentz takes on the Washington football team, and Carson Wentz is limited on what he really has at the receiver position. Jalen Reagor, his rookie first-round receiver, is not expected to play. And then, really, Miles Sanders is going to be limited. I also am afraid of that Washington front seven getting pressure after Carson Wentz. I know you probably drafted him to be your starter, but I think I would be a little concerned about this matchup. I think there's other matchups that you can exploit that are better than this one. Baker Mayfield versus the Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore played very well versus Mayfield a year ago in both matchups. And Baker, he still needs to prove to me whether he has it or not with Odell Beckham Jr. and the rest of his group of weapons, including Austin Hooper, who's new to the team. Baltimore has a very good secondary. They have one of the best pass defenses in the NFL and one of the best defensive coordinators. It's Mayfield's first week in a new offense. I'd stay away from Baker this week. And Matthew Stafford versus Chicago. While I love Stafford this season, I think Chicago is one of the tougher, really, matchups he's going to have all year. He does not have Kenny Golladay. So that being said, I would probably stay away from starting Stafford in week number uno. The running back starts. Todd Gurley, man. You got to start Todd Gurley this week. He's healthy. He's ready to go. Apparently having a pretty good overall camp. He lit up the Seattle Seahawks throughout the course of his career. And Seattle's defensive line, I'm concerned about it. I think Atlanta could have some success on the ground or through the air, exploiting the matchup of Todd Gurley, a healthy Todd Gurley in week number 1. Start him while you can. You look at Jonathan Taylor versus the Jacksonville Jags. I understand that many are concerned he won't get enough touches, but I think the Colts are going to absolutely blow the doors off of Jacksonville in this game, which means that all their runners will get a fair share of carries. I do not expect them to pass the ball much. And Jacksonville is just a team that is smaller on defense. They're more built on quickness, speed, and I just think the Colts can straight up literally run them into the ground. I think Taylor's going to be a big part of that, and if he just sees a crease, he can take it to the house. Raheem Mostert versus Arizona. Mostert, I think, is one of the more underrated or not talked enough about runners in the NFL right now heading into this year. He could see a lot of work this game versus Arizona to keep Kyler off the football field to help his defense out. And then also the fact that Jimmy G doesn't have a lot of receivers available to him would probably mean that Mostert might be available more often in the passing game, maybe some screens to him that you don't expect, and I do expect him to get a heavy workload on the ground. So Raheem Mostert's definitely a start this week. Zach Moss might be a surprising one. I understand it's a bit risky here, riskier than the others, but Moss could see a big workload versus the Jets. The Jets are a terrible team. I think this is going to be a blowout. I think the Bills are going to completely dominate this game. And if that's the case, Zach Moss will see a lot of work in the second half. He's also the goal line back, so I expect Moss to get a couple touchdowns possibly, and maybe more carries than we're expecting in week number 1. Running back sits. Let's just look at the teams that have committees, all right? New England, Miami, Tampa Bay. Do not start any of these guys if you can. New England, Sony Michel is going to be worked in slowly into this group coming off of an injury. James White, I'm not sure how he'll look with Cam Newton at quarterback. Rex Burkhead probably isn't on your mind as a start. Miami, Matt Breida or Jordan Howard don't have a great matchup versus New England, and I don't really know how the carries are going to split between the two of them, so I'm staying away there as well. And Tampa Bay, I'm not trying to start Ronald Jones if I don't have to, and I'm definitely not starting Leonard Fournette, seeing as how he's probably not even going to be the starter this week. Tampa Bay, I just would not go anywhere near that matchup versus New Orleans. They're a good run defense as it is, and really, we don't know who's getting the ball. DeAndre Swift versus Chicago. I understand he is now upgraded to healthy, and he's going to play versus Chicago. I just don't know how much, again, he's going to get the football. There's Kerryon Johnson there to take away touches. They brought in Adrian Peterson for early in the season. Swift might be a great back to break out later in the year, but for week 1, I just wait and see. The wide receiver starts. I have a couple surprise ones here, starting off with Edwards, the rookie receiver that's had a massive camp for the Las Vegas Raiders. Edwards, people are saying, is just taking over camp at wide receiver, and John Gruden loves this kid. He's going to be starting in 2 receiver sets. He's going to be on the field regularly. They lost Tyrell Williams for the year. Edwards will now take his spot on the opposite side of Henry Ruggs, with Hunter Renfrow playing in the slot in 3 receiver sets. Carolina has a terrible cornerback group with a terrible secondary. Carr should have a big game, as I mentioned, and I think a lot of those targets will go to Edwards, seeing as how Edwards will likely line up against Eli Apple, who might be the worst starting corner in the NFL. CeeDee Lamb versus the Rams. CeeDee Lamb is a baller. They drafted him in the first round for a reason, even though they did not need to. And when you look at the Rams secondary, Jalen Ramsey will be one-on-one with Amari Cooper all game long. I'm not sitting Amari Cooper. I'm still starting him because of where you drafted him and because he's too good to sit. But CeeDee Lamb might benefit from more targets this game than most games, and this would be a game where I could see the first-round pick breaking out early in this season. Deshaun Jackson usually torches Washington, and when you look at the corners, there's no reason he cannot once again. Moreau, Darby, doesn't matter. Nobody can keep up to Jackson's pure downfield speed and playmaking ability. He's healthy, which means you start him when he's the number 1 receiver for Carson Wentz. Deontay Johnson versus the Giants might be a sneaky start this week. James Bradbury more than likely will see a lot of Juju or maybe even Chase Claypool because of the size difference there. But Deontay Johnson will be an issue for any of these Giants corners because Johnson is such a great quick route runner and crisp route runner that I think he'll be open a lot versus these slower corners of the New York Giants. I also expect them to pass all over this defense. My wide receiver sets. Let's start off with Devontae Parker versus New England. I understand that Parker went off versus Gilmore in Week 17, and you might be aware of that and understanding that you probably don't want to sit him versus Gilmore this week. But tell me if he does go off again, because he's never had a good game outside of that Week 17 performance versus Gilmore. I'm not expecting it to happen 2 times in a row, especially with Gilmore being more motivated because of that. I think Gilmore comes out and has a massive game versus Parker in this one. If you have to start him as your wide receiver 3, I get it, but if you're really loaded at the position and you have other options, like maybe some of them that I have on the start section here, I would lean towards sitting Parker. AJ Green, this is a similar sit for me. The Chargers have, just like New England, a very good secondary with Casey Hayward, Desmond King, Chris Harris. AJ Green's coming off of an injury. He hasn't played in a very long time. I understand he's AJ Green, but you drafted him so that you didn't have to start him weekly. I would sit him in week 1 and see how he plays and see how he looks physically before trusting him in my lineup. Darius Slayton versus Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh does have a solid secondary, but that's not the thing I'm really concerned about. I think Pittsburgh's pass rush is going to give Daniel Jones issues, and I expect Pittsburgh to really be dominating this game. Now, maybe Slayton gets some garbage time points, but I just don't love the matchup. It's versus one of the best defenses in the NFL. I'd fade Slayton because he's probably your number 4 receiver. You probably have better options on your roster regardless. Deebo Samuel versus Arizona. This is just the weekly reminder to not sit guys that are questionable or out. Deebo was just officially, before going on air here, ruled out. And Mike Evans, doubtful. Kenny Golladay, doubtful. All of those guys you need to check before you start your lineup on Sunday. Do not start them, please. Please be aware and pick somebody up or start somebody on your bench. My tight end starts. We got Gronk versus New Orleans. I just mentioned how Mike Evans is going to be most likely out this game, first week. Well, if there's ever a time to start the great Gronk, it's probably week 1. And you might have drafted him as your number 1 tight end. If you did, certainly start him. If you draft him as a high upside number 2 with probably two options that you're debating on, I would lean Gronk here because he's going to see more red zone targets, more targets in general. With Evans out, they're very similar kind of receivers in that regard. And I do believe Gronk is healthy, he's fit, he's ready to go, and I think he could have a big game week 1 with his quarterback, Tom Brady. Nobody is trusted more than Gronk when it comes to Tom Brady. Eric Ebron versus the Giants. I love Ebron this year. I think he could have another big year, a bounce back year from a year ago. I think he's going to be the primary red zone weapon for Big Ben. And like I said earlier with Deontay Johnson and with Big Ben himself, this is going to be a game where I think the Steelers offense really shows promise and has a lot of points up on that scoreboard. I think Eric Ebron could be responsible for a few of those points. TJ Hawkinson versus Chicago. Kenny Golladay, I mentioned, doubtful for the game. If he does not suit up, I would not pick up Amendola. I would instead start Hawkinson, who's been taking over camp. He is a year 2 breakout candidate, and he could see really a lot of footballs versus Chicago. Chicago actually wasn't great versus the tight end position despite being a good defense last year. So TJ Hawkinson might be a sneaky start. Jack Doyle versus Jacksonville. Jack Doyle is going to be the number 2 target, at least early on in this offense, behind T.Y. Hilton. He might be a sneaky start for Phillip Rivers as well. Phillip Rivers loves his tight ends traditionally, especially in the red zone, so Jack Doyle could maybe score a touchdown in this game. My tight end sits. Noah Fant versus Tennessee. Tennessee just has really good safety play, really good linebacker play, whether it's Jaylen Brown or Byard or Kenny Vaccaro. Any of these guys are really good at covering tight ends and taking away that position overall. I'm also skeptical about what Drew Lock will look like in week 1, so I would fade Fant. Jonnu Smith, the guy that's facing Fant on Monday Night Football. I would fade him as well, and that is due to the same reason. I mean, if he's covered by Simmons all day, he's going to be limited. And if he's covered by Kareem Jackson, the same thought. I think Denver is probably weaker at the corner position, meaning that the Titans receivers will see most of the work in the receiving game. Chris Herndon versus Buffalo. I understand that he's going to see a lot of targets, and I don't disagree there, but that's mostly going to be manufactured touches versus a very good pass defense. Herndon's probably going to be one of the primary focuses for Buffalo, along with Jamison Crowder, and Buffalo has just an fabulous secondary, so I would probably fade him if I have another option. And Austin Hooper versus Baltimore, he's new to this offense. We haven't seen it yet, and Baltimore was the best team versus tight ends a year ago, so I would fade Hooper. Now, my defense starts Philadelphia versus Washington, Indy versus Jacksonville, Detroit versus Chicago. This is the first year I've actually added this to the mix because you guys always ask me who to stream on defense, and I do feel it is important. Philadelphia should have a couple turnovers versus Washington, or at the very least, multiple sacks with their great defensive line. They should dominate Haskins in this matchup and dominate this offense. Indy, I expect a couple turnovers versus Gardner Minshew trying to throw himself back into this game. They're a very underrated defense. You probably drafted them with one of your last picks. I think they're going to see an explosion week 1 and look like a really promising unit from the get-go. And the one that you could probably get off the waiver wire is Detroit. Detroit plays Mitchell Trubisky, okay? And I understand Mitch Trubisky has been good versus Detroit in the past, but this is a different Detroit defense. Matt Patricia, he is not exactly happy with how he has coached his defense and how his defense is played under him, but he's brought in all of the assets to make a change. Daron Harmon, Jamie Collins, Danny Shelton, Jeffrey Okudah. These guys are going to be all over the field. I think Detroit is going to play fast defensively. They're going to play with an edge and something to prove, and I think they're going to start with a very weak Chicago offense in dominating form. There you go, guys. Week number 1 starts and sits. I hope you enjoyed. Again, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. I'll be back here tomorrow on Saturday to answer all your fantasy questions that you leave here, and I'll be going live so that you guys can also ask them live. So thanks, guys, for joining me. It's Mitch of the Bottom Line View. If you enjoyed, again, Gronk, spike that like button and subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more weekly fantasy starts and sits. Peace.